Okay, let's get into this. Today we're doing a deep dive into some really interesting material about the huge demands on military service members.
Yeah, I mean, the environment they operate in, it's incredibly high stress, unpredictable.
Exactly. Needing these super quick, clear decisions under immense pressure. And some of the data in these sources is pretty eye-opening. Like one recent Navy survey mentioned, nearly 2 out of 5 enlisted sailors feeling severely or extremely stressed.
That's a significant number. It's a kind of sustained, intense pressure you just don't see in many other places.
Right. And what really jumps out from the sources is this shift, this growing idea across the whole U.S. military, that mental training, building that inner resilience, it's becoming fundamental.
Absolutely. Seen as just as vital as the physical side, the physical conditioning for actual combat readiness and performing well.
So that's really the core idea we're digging into today. Our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to unpack these sources and figure out how military psychologists are actually doing this. How are they using things like mindfulness, cognitive training?
Not just for general wellness, but really to build resilience. Sharpen focus.
Yeah, and optimize performance when it counts. Turning mental strength into, a strategic asset. The sources use these metaphors like push-ups for the mind.
Or bicep curls for the brain. It sounds a bit catchy, but it gets the idea across.
It does. And when you look at the specific stressors, the sources list deployment, combat, being away from family for ages, even just coming back to civilian life.
You see why this kind of training isn't just a nice to have. The pressure is relentless.
And the science behind it, which the sources detail, is fascinating. There's this neuroscience perspective. It basically says attention is the brain's boss. It directs everything.
Right. But stress, feeling threatened, being in a negative mood, all that stuff fundamentally undermines the boss.
It degrades our ability to focus, which is obviously critical when a split-second lapse could be catastrophic.
Exactly. And that leads us into the work of neuroscientist Amishi Ha and her team. The sources explain how they've been studying this since, shortly after 9/11.
Looking specifically at how stress hits attention in these really high-demand jobs, like the military.
Yeah, they figured if stress messes with attention, that directly impacts military performance. So they developed a specific training program
called Mindfulness-Based Attention Training, MBAT.
That's the one. MBA.
And how does it work? Is it some huge, intensive thing? The sources make it sound pretty manageable.
It is, relatively. It's an 8-hour course, but it's spread out over 4 weeks. And they actually researched the minimum effective dose.
Oh, interesting. Like medicine?
Kind of, yeah. Turns out just 12 to 15 minutes of practice, maybe 3 or 4 days a week, seems to be enough to make a difference. It's designed to fit into packed schedules.
Okay, so what did they find? What happens when people do this training?
Well, the findings in the sources are pretty compelling. MBAT seems to genuinely protect and even strengthen attention.
Okay.
And it also improves working memory and helps regulate mood for service members.
What stood out to me reading this was the practical side. It wasn't just people saying, I feel better. The sources say MBAT-trained soldiers actually performed better, specifically in marksmanship under stress.
Exactly. Fewer attention lapses, they managed their emotions better, showed more mental toughness.
That link between the internal practice and the external measurable result under pressure, that feels really important.
It's key. And here's a really interesting detail from the research. They used a train-the-trainer approach, meaning soldiers were trained by instructors who were also military, people who understood the culture. And those soldiers actually performed better than the ones trained by civilian mindfulness experts who didn't have that background.
Huh. Why do you think that is? Does familiarity make that much difference?
The sources suggest it boils down to trust. Maybe the language used, the context. If the instructor gets the unique pressures and the way things work in the military.
It makes the training feel more relevant, less like something imposed from outside.
Precisely. It integrates better, maybe feels less, soft or disconnected from the mission.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for that kind of environment.
Yeah.
And it's clear this isn't just stuck in a lab somewhere. The sources show MBI is being rolled out pretty widely.
Oh, yeah. From basic combat training right up to one-star generals in the Army, it's getting traction.
And internationally, too.
Right. Australia, New Zealand, Ukraine, Singapore, they're all looking at it, according to the sources. That level of interest says something.
And for accessibility, the sources mentioned Jaha wrote a book, Peak Mind, explaining it all.
And there's an app, too, developed with the DoD, pushups for the mind.mil. Free for active duty, reserves, guard, students at military schools.
Okay, so that's the science, the foundational program. But how does this actually get applied across different levels? It can't be the same for a general as for a new recruit, right?
No, definitely not. The sources show it's tailored. Take the U.S. Army War College, for instance. You've got psychologists Maurice Sipos and Kelly Ime teaching senior leaders.
And their course title, Peak Mind, Brain Health and the Power of Paying Attention, leans right into Jaha's work.
Heavily based on the neuroscience. And, smartly, the sources point out they framed it carefully.
Using terms like attentional fitness.
Exactly. Not mental health or even resilience, necessarily. Attentional fitness sounds more like performance optimization, which tends to resonate better with leaders focused on effectiveness.
Less potential stigma, perhaps. More about gaining an edge.
That seems to be the idea. And apparently it worked. The sources say it was the most popular elective its first semester, still near the top.
So what are these senior officers actually doing in the course?
It sounds pretty involved. Daily practices, some optional yoga, mindful eating exercises, applying it in group leadership drills, plus weekly journaling to track their own, mental processes.
And the outcomes. What are they reporting?
Well, besides the expected things better focus, handling stress better, a really crucial outcome highlighted is less bias in decision-making.
How does training attention connect to making less biased decisions?
The sources explain it like this. When you build that attentional control, that self-awareness, you're less likely to get totally swept away by your first emotional reaction or just fall back on old habits, especially when the pressure's on.
So you can pause and choose a response rather than just reacting.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Kelly Ime is quoted saying, "A clearer mind, one less clouded by that emotional reactivity, leads to better, more effective decisions." You're not just defaulting to the easy answer. Sipos frames it all as optimizing cognitive performance.
Wow, that directly ties this mental training to strategic thinking at the top. Okay, let's shift gears. What about the other end of the spectrum, entry level? The sources mention West Point.
Right. Psychologist Ryan Erb there sees this training for cadets as more of a long-term investment.
How so?
He views it as building a foundation, giving them an edge for the physical demands, the mental toughness needed, and just the intense academics at West Point.
And the sources also bring up character formation. Why is that angle important for cadets?
Well, emotional regulation, self-control, they're seen as fundamental for ethical leadership. When you're in incredibly intense situations later on, making the right call isn't just about knowing the rules.
It's about having the composure to actually follow through under pressure.
Exactly. Having the self-command to do the right thing, even when it's hard or you're facing, moral challenges.
And there's a social aspect too, right? The sources mention a study about how cadets perceive these practices.
Yes, using something called the reasoned action approach. It found that what cadets thought important people around them, especially leaders, believed they should do, was a huge predictor of whether the cadets themselves planned to meditate or use these techniques.
So, in a place like West Point, with its strong hierarchy, if the leaders buy in and show it,
the cadets are much more likely to see it as valuable, legitimate behavior. Irby emphasizes how important it is for the leadership, the officers, to have a positive view. That social norm really helps it take root.
Okay, so we're seeing this tailored approach. Senior leaders, cadets. It feels like a really comprehensive strategy. Leanne Perry at the U.S. Naval War College seems to be involved in that broader picture, too.
Absolutely. The sources describe her designing programs to boost cognitive fitness and readiness at multiple levels in the Navy.
Like what kind of things?
Well, guided techniques for individuals, for one, but also psychology electives for students there with sessions on mindful breathing, body scans, things like that.
And she's briefing senior officers, too.
Yes. Specifically connecting mindfulness to decision-making, performance, and even, the sources note, military lethality.
That's a very direct framing. Lethality. Wow.
It underscores the seriousness of the application, and she's also looking at team-level stuff, ways to improve how teams communicate and perform together under stress.
And crucially, the sources highlight her work, includes extending support to military families. Why bring families into this strategic picture?
It's seen as vital. The sources explain that if a service member is deployed, worrying about their family struggling back home is a massive distraction. It directly impacts their focus and performance on the mission.
So supporting the spouse, the kids, actually helps the service member stay mission ready.
That's the logic. It frees up their mental bandwidth.
Wow.
Carrie puts it very bluntly in the context of global competition.
What does she say?
She's quoted saying something like, "Our adversaries are doing mental training. They are preparing cognitively and emotionally. We need to maximize how we prepare our people, and taking care of their families helps them prepare and be ready."
So mental training, even family support, is positioned as a competitive necessity.
Exactly. Not just nice, but necessary to keep pace.
It really sounds like this is moving beyond just isolated programs and becoming embedded in the actual culture, especially in the Navy, based on the sources.
Yeah. They talk about integrating mindfulness into these big, comprehensive resiliency programs, teaching self-awareness, self-regulation, emotional intelligence, stress management as core skills.
Skills that help everywhere, not just on duty.
That's the goal. Develop mental tools that optimize performance across life. Like the Navy's Warrior Toughness Initiative, it introduces recruits to breathing, visualization, grounding exercises right at the start.
And Commander Adeline, a Navy clinical psychologist quoted in the sources, has this really sharp insight about the language.
Right. She points out that a lot of Navy training already involves mindful practices, essentially.
Like what?
Like the intense focus you need when handling a weapon, the controlled breath, the pause before acting. Service members do this stuff naturally, they just don't call it mindfulness.
So part of the challenge is just bridging that vocabulary, helping them see the connection.
Precisely. By framing it as cognitive fitness training that enhances performance language, that resonates in the operational community, it makes it easier for them to embrace these ideas, much more than if it was presented only as, say, therapy.
And she makes this really powerful comparison to elite athletes, doesn't she?
Yeah, highlighting the unique demands. Elite athletes compete, then they go home, rest, recover.
But sailors, Marines,
they're expected to sustain that peak performance, physically and mentally, for weeks or months straight on deployment. That requires incredible mental endurance, which this kind of training aims to build.
So when you pull all this source material together, it paints a really clear picture. This is a serious, science-driven effort across the U.S. military.
Yeah, reaching individuals, teams, leaders, even families. It's comprehensive.
And it really reinforces that strategic view from the sources.
Yeah.
This isn't just about feeling better. It's about ensuring mindfulness and cognitive training are seen as, well, strategic assets.
Tools for focusing better, enduring more, and excelling under the most extreme pressure imaginable. It's performance optimization, not just wellness.
Which really leaves you thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given how vital focus, resilience, clear thinking under pressure are, and seeing how the military is investing in these mental push-ups as a strategic thing, where else? Where in your own life, your work, and when you face pressure and need to be at your best, could applying some of these same ideas give you a similar strategic advantage?